For more videos on people's struggles, please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Elections were held in Iraq on October 10th. These were vital considering the political crisis in the country since the mass protests that began in 2019. The elections were held with a new system of constituencies under the broad framework that was put in place by the US after they invaded Iraq in 2003. The biggest winner was the Muqtada al-Sadr-led Sayroon Alliance, which emerged with around 75 seats in the 329-seat parliament. The alliance, along with some other parties, may form the next government. Some sections of the political establishment contested the results and staged protests. Meanwhile, there was also a drone attack on Prime Minister Mustafa al-Kadhimi's residence. How do we understand the political situation in Iraq? Who is Muqtada al-Sadr and what is his agenda? Rania Khalik of Breakthrough News explains.
The situation in Iraq post-election is still up in the air, and for a couple reasons, but let me just give you some background to kind of understand why the situation is the way it is. So for Shias who make up the majority of the electorate in Iraq, the battle had once been for them to maintain their hold on power through the position that they have, which is the prime minister's seat. Now, we all know that America set up a government in Iraq that's a sectarian government where certain seats or certain positions are allotted to certain sects. And so for the Shias, it's the prime minister's seat. And the Shias of Iraq had once been insecure, knowing that they had attained the seat of prime minister by coming essentially on the backs of American tanks, and kind of worried that the Baathists or Sunni extremists backed by regional players were conspiring to remove them from power. But then after 2014, due to the rise of ISIS, there was this feeling among the Shias of Iraq of a kind of legitimacy, that they had really earned their power through fighting to liberate their country from ISIS, and that they were no longer just collaborators who benefited from the American occupation. They felt more secure, and it was understood that that choosing the prime minister was a matter for the Shias themselves only. And this background is important because it's important to remember because, in 2019, it appeared to those Shias who saw themselves as the liberators of the country from ISIS that their military, the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, we call it the Hashd al-Shabi in Arabic, that their military and subsequent political gains were being attacked by internal and external foes when their authority to select the prime minister was essentially undermined when Abdul Mahdi, the former prime minister, the candidate they had produced, was removed. And his successor was proposed by the Kurdish president. And again, this goes back to which seats are given to which ethnic groups and sects based on how the Americans set up the government. And what followed was their removal from ministries that they believed they had earned through victories at the ballot box. And I'm talking after the 2019 October uprising in Iraq. And what they believed was a conspiracy between Halbusi, who's the Speaker of Parliament, and Muqtada Sadr to gerrymander districts in such a way as to prevent them, the Shias, from repeating their 2018 election gains. Well, in reality, Muqtada Sadr had just been seeking to remove Abdul Mahdi and his ministers because his share on the government was too small for his liking. That's another story. But this background would become relevant in the days after October 10th, the elections. And as an aside, one reason for the relatively low turnout and, voter apathy in Iraq, because there was a lot was made about the low voter turnout, that may also be due to the fact that now that the Shia rule is essentially secure, or at least people feel it's secure, it's really harder to motivate Shias to go vote. And that brings us, to the Iraqi elections. There was the very low turnout. It was riddled with irregularities and corruption. And based on this, the result was disputed by the anti-American Shia parties, but even by former Shia allies of the Americans, like former Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi. So many people were very upset with what they felt were the sort of like fraud, irregularities, corruption in these elections. They demanded a manual count, and they protested, and protesters were shot at. And then someone, and it's still not entirely clear who, but someone sent a drone armed with light explosives to hit the prime minister's house when he was not there, the prime minister being Kademi. So it wasn't an assassination attempt. And if it was from a Shia faction, then it was from a very, very small, new Shia faction that is out of control. And all the big Shia factions are absolutely furious. Iran is furious. Lebanese Hezbollah is furious. They weren't even hostile to Prime Minister Kademi. So it may have just been a message, an angry response to the killing of protesters a couple days earlier. But it also serves the interests of the prime minister, the current prime minister Kademi, and his team, who want to look like victims and heroes and capitalize. They capitalized on it quite quickly for propaganda purposes. We just don't know yet. But what we do know is that it doesn't seem to be a big deal at all in Iraqi politics. And everyone returned to the negotiations over who gets how many ministries and positions in the new government following the elections. Well, it's interesting because Muqtada Sadr in the US media has received glowing coverage as though he has this progressive platform that appealed to masses of people. But the reality of Iraq is that the Sadrist movement isn't a movement around any particular ideology. It's a movement around a figure, Muqtada Sadr. That's it. It doesn't go really any deeper. I mean, it does go deeper. It's something you're kind of born into, but there's not ideology to it. And Muqtada Sadr isn't offering anything new. And it's not, he didn't get a plurality, I guess you could say, of votes among the Shias because he's specifically so popular. But actually what happened is many of these Shia parties that grew out of the sort of, resistance axis, as they call it, they ran in small parties against each other. So they weren't on any sort of unified ticket. So as a result, perhaps if they had been on some sort of unified ticket, maybe they could have won a bigger share. But because they didn't, a lot of the base that supports the resistance axis was split among all these different parties to choose from. And as a result, Muqtada Sadr gained, and also because of the gerrymandering that I mentioned earlier. So he is, of course, in a more powerful position. And people are very unhappy about that, especially those who support the Hashd Shabi, those who support the sort of pro-Iran side of the region, because they see him as some kind of agent of the Saudis or a kind of chameleon who will sort of ally with anyone who will give him more power, like a lot of politicians are. So, it's still too early to tell exactly how it's going to turn out because all the political negotiations are still ongoing, but he certainly will have a bigger role because of these elections to play in these negotiations.
The 2019 protests were a massive upsurge against the political system in Iraq. The protesters demanded an end to the sectarian political system and also wanted solutions to long-pending economic issues, including unemployment. The protesters were often met with violence. Close to 600 people are believed to have died during these incidents. Have the elections managed to meet the aspirations of the protesters? Rania explains.
The 2021 elections may be transparent and monitored or whatever, but they nor will the uprising that thought they would benefit from these elections but didn't, they won't lead to any progress. And here's why. No party in Iraq is proposing dealing with economic rights or economic democracy or challenging the extreme social inequalities in Iraq, or really offering solutions at all to overcome the failing rentier state in Iraq. Most Iraqis live in just absolute poverty, and sadly, they'll remain so regardless of who they vote for, because, and their needs, the needs I'm talking about here are, welfare, medical care, housing, education, social, economic rights. They won't be addressed by any of the parties, including those that emerged out of the protest movement and who really lack any ideology and seemingly want to merely replace the older sectarian corrupt officials with younger liberal corrupt officials. Because, the nature of the protests were very liberal and were kind of quickly hijacked by outside forces that interfere in Iraqi politics to try to benefit themselves. I mean, Western forces, Gulf forces. And sadly, as a result, that ends up leading to this sort of like liberalism to nowhere. And sadly, that means Iraq will continue to remain in this kind of survival economy mode where policies advocated, such as reducing poverty, good governance, fighting corruption, etc., are nothing more than the management of pauperization in order to make it politically acceptable. And the system it's not sustainable, and it's for ecological reasons and due to lack of resources, or rather due to the fact that Iraq's one resource will soon be in less demand. And of course, I'm talking about oil. But the impoverished working class, in Iraq remains extremely divided along sectarian and ethnic and tribal and regional lines. And as a result, it isn't able to organize to challenge this system that, let's remember, lots of times the system is portrayed as being corrupt because something's backwards or wrong or uncivilized about Iraqis. But this is a system that was set up by the Americans. Iraqis learned this system from the Americans. And the protest movement sadly transformed what began as really a quest for a dignified economic life, with frustration directed at specific parties or at the fact that activists didn't have the same power as the parties. But the immediate needs of most Iraqis are economic and to be rescued from poverty, and that hasn't been addressed by anyone.